India's democracy has now become the subject of fierce global debate. On this program today, we will attempt to bring you differing perspectives of this debate. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our focus today is on the Journal of Democracy that actually had five extremely interesting, compelling essays by five of the world's leading experts on the subject. The question, of course, looked at India's democracy. Is India the same democracy that it was? Has democracy really taken a knock in the way that many Western commentators seem to believe that it has? How do we separate the rhetoric from the reality? How do we explain the robust elections with enthusiastic participation, but also look at growing concerns about whether the media, for example, is still genuinely free? Is the BJP more guilty than other political parties of trying to diminish these freedoms? Or basically, is every Indian politician who has an opportunity out to weaken democratic values? These and many other complex questions form the focus of the five essays in the Journal of Democracy. And because on this platform, we attempt to have a civil debate, a genuine conversation on difficult, complex issues, we're very pleased to introduce our guests this evening on the broadcast. All five expert writers who contributed to the Journal of Democracy, looking at the debate around Indian democracy, are with us. Let's bring up our guests one by one as we look at this very interesting, intriguing, some would say intractable question. Joining us up first is Maya Tudor. Maya, of course, is with the Blavatnik School at the Oxford University. It's good to see you, Maya. Also joining us is Professor Sumit Ganguly from the Indiana University. It's good to see you, Professor Ganguly, after a long time. Also joining us, back to the Mojo Story, is Tripurdaman Singh. He's a writer and historian with a very interesting book, by the way, on the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution. It's good to see you, Tripur. Also joining us on the platform for the very first time, I want to welcome from Penn State, Vineeta Yadav. It's good to see you, Ms. Yadav. Welcome to the program. And also joining us from the Center for Policy Research is Rahul Verma. Rahul has been with us several times, and it's good to have you back with us. So what I've actually done is I've, of course, gone through all of the five essays that all five of you wrote. And just for easy access to our audience, we've picked up 3 or 4 key quotes from each of your essays that will probably help you in a way frame the debate and the conversation this evening. So let me start with you, Rahul. Let me start with you, because you argue that the death of Indian democracy is greatly exaggerated, and you believe that this is something which suffers from what you call a recency bias, that because our most recent memory is of the government that is presently in power, a very powerful BJP-led government, there is what you call a recency bias. Why do you believe that this entire debate around declining Indian democracy is vastly exaggerated, as you argue in your column? Let's start with you, Rahul.
Thank you, Barkha. So let me say a couple of points. One, my piece, and I think many others in this symposium and those who have been writing elsewhere, I don't think any of us are saying that there are not areas of concern, right? And so we all agree on that institutions are under stress and certain components of what you will call as democracy index, India is not doing that great. Where I sort of disagree with my fellow scholars is that, one, to say that to actually use this term backsliding means that there was some good moments of Indian democracy or actually a golden period of Indian democracy. We don't know what that golden, so one needs to have a baseline to establish it, whether that baseline was 1989 to 2014 or between 67 to 89 or even before that. So I don't know when the golden period of Indian democracy was and on what accounts we were doing exceptionally then. Second, and I think this is where, like, because most of these democracy indices, except the Freedom House Index, are actually recent indices, meaning that like the Economist and the VDEM, all of these got created in last 10 years. And so people are basically sitting in 2013 and 2014 and they're coding about what India was like in 1970s or 1980s. And so what you are doing is basically your worldview of today is shaping your worldview of tomorrow, yesterday. Third,
Hmm.
now there are actually research coming up which basically shows that if you look at these indices, there are basically objective indicators and then there are subjective indicators. So objective indicators would be, say, turnout and whether there is a change of government or not. And then there are subjective indicators, right? Even on, say, media freedom, there is some objective indicator that how many journalists have been jailed and how many journalists have died and other things. And then there are subjective indicators, whether you actually have ability to write and publish what you want to, or not. Analysis actually of these democracy indices suggests that on objective indicators, most countries are doing fine. It's the subjective indicators where coders seems to be much more harsher than what the objective indicators suggest. So I'm not
Right.
like include here, I'm not at all saying that there are no areas of concern, but to say that the current moment is basically unprecedented and there's death of democracy, I think we are exaggerating that.
Yeah. You also make a very interesting point, which I'll come to later, where you say that simultaneously there are parts of Indian democracy that are deepening and parts that are shrinking. And I want to understand that a little more in depth. But let's get the others in. Maya Tudor, you are not at all coming from the place that Rahul's coming from. You actually argue in your essay that democracy in India is dying. And you make the point that there's a certain amount of what you call window dressing that is possible that actually hides or cloaks institutional damage. You go on to, there's this very compelling line I remember from your essay where you say that if democracies are going to diminish, it's going to be by, then they're not going to explode, they're going to erode. I'm paraphrasing you, and we'll have the exact quotes of what you said up in just a moment. Let's bring you in. Maya, go ahead.
Yeah, Barkha, I think you said it when you said at the start. Let's separate the rhetoric from the reality. And I do think we all agree that there are problems. And I think we can all agree, fellow panelists, correct me if I'm wrong, that India's democracy has never been perfect. And there are no countries that have perfect democracies. And it's the job actually of these kinds of forums to have a discussion about where there are problems. But the lifeblood of a democracy is not just elections and whether competition exists at the moment of elections. Because on those parameters, ostensibly, India is doing fine. Now, across the world, and lots of very compelling scholars have shown this, that the ways that democracy are dying today is through the rights of civil people to dissent without being labeled traitors, without being labeled anti-national. And this is not something that's to India, actually. This is something that's happening elsewhere as well. But I think a really important point I want to make is that, democracy is not like kind of pregnancy. You're either are or you aren't. It's a lot more like thinking about the weather, right? So we have weather forecasters, and weather forecasters say it's going to be sunny today. And that doesn't mean there's no cloud in the sky, right? Just like that, democracies have problems. There might be clouds, but people around the table who are looking at this, and I think Rahul makes a good point. Some of these indicators democracy indices are old, but Freedom House is not, and it has shown an appreciable decline into the kind of middle region, which is we call hybrid regimes. So India has moved in this area before. It doesn't mean it's going to necessarily stay in the area. But when weather forecasters see enough clouds in the sky, they say, look, this is problematic. It is no longer a sunny day. It is now a partly cloudy day. And that's where India is. And, we can talk about the formal indicators and biases and so forth of those indicators, but there's a reason why, just like central banks don't get to set interest rates, governments themselves are not the institutions that say whether they themselves are democratic, right? We have independent institutions.
Right.
And then he said that, American democracy also has problems. So it isn't the case that this is, I think, coming under bias. So let's, instead of calling the people out for being biased, let's look at the real problems that exist in terms of looking at the right of individuals to dissent. And
Right.
on those indicators, there are real declines. And just, one little anecdote which I drew out in my article, which is, my students, when they want to talk about this, they say to me, let's not put anything online. Let's not put it on a website if we're going to meet to discuss whether India is a democracy. And that's because they're scared. And that's a real difference today that I have not. And I've been, writing about India for 20 years.
And I was actually going to throw social media into the mix to actually wonder whether it distorts and amplifies the noise a little more than if we were just the six of us sitting around a table having this conversation, as we're trying to do today. Tripurdaman, you have a very interesting argument. You're not denying that there are certain institutional freedoms that aren't as deep as they should be. But I think the point you're making is that this is hardwired into both the constitutional and the political culture from the get-go. So this isn't about, according to you, the Modi government in the last 9 years. This isn't about the last decade. This started, as you have chronicled in another book, with the very first amendment to the Constitution. And that comparing India to the West is a kind of waste of time because, for example, let's take America, where the First and the Second Amendment both are so deeply enshrined that actually the second creates problems, which is the right to sort of carry arms. You're saying culturally this country has evolved from a different place. Go ahead, Tripur.
Yes, I mean, the thing is, the normative kind of underpinning of our constitution is very, very different, and that's been acknowledged not just by me, but by a host of other scholars. So the constitution isn't created, unlike America, to really constrain government power and enlarge the domain of civic freedom. It's completely the opposite. It's meant to direct and channel executive power generally towards social reform, but also given that the context in which the Constitution was made, there's an overriding concern with national unity and the security of the state. So right from the outset, we've never had a domain, like a very expansive domain of public freedom or civic freedom, and because we haven't had it, there is that. Like Rahul said, a lot of the criticism suffers from a recency bias because it's always at that domain is at the capriciousness of the government, having already given the legal and constitutional tools for them to constrain that space whenever they want to for particular reasons, generally social reform, security of the state. It's a bit facetious to complain by saying that they're using the powers that they have been constitutionally and legally granted for the constitutional and legal purposes that they've been granted them. So that's one. The second point, of course, that I make is that structurally, a lot of, again, I don't make it in terms of recency bias, but structurally, a lot of this criticism is set against the coalition period from 1989 to 2014. And that automatically dissipated executive power by virtue of the fact that no one could muster an electoral majority. But in the states where electoral majorities could be mustered, you had a very, very different picture, even during the coalition era. I mean, a lot of these trends and a lot of these tools have actually been solidified in Indian politics, in the states, much, much earlier.
Yeah. And let me take that actually to Vineeta Yadav, because Vineeta, you partially agree with the argument I've just heard, which is that Indian politicians in general, you say in your essay, have never been sort of advocates or champions of democratic values. It suits politicians across the spectrum to diminish them, but you believe that the BJP is more so guilty of that than other parties. You also had your own survey where you found that more BJP politicians than other politicians actually, for example, supported the judiciary being in control of the executive and of parliament. So go ahead, Vineeta Yadav.
Yes, so I think, before I respond to that, I do want to say that we need to differentiate between any analysis that is done by, the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, people who are not longtime students of Indian politics, and people who do study Indian politics systematically, because no serious analysis of Indian politics is going to compare it to Western democracy. Okay, not at its foundational moment, not through the decades, not today, for a variety of reasons. So when we are comparing India today and the status of democracy in India today, we need to compare it to India's own past. We don't have to have a golden period of Indian democracy. We just need to identify when are the periods when Indian democracy was doing better, and have we improved relative to that, or have we declined relative to that? So we are our own benchmark. We are, the West is not our benchmark. Now, having said that, I think if you look at institutions, right? Institutions are rules that structure elite behavior, but they are neither necessary nor sufficient either for democracy or for dictatorship. China's constitution is one of the most liberal on paper in the world. Okay, and India's constitution, if you look at it over its 75 years of history, I agree with Tripurdaman. There are inbuilt authoritarian biases in the constitution, but the constitution has not changed at the same moments and at the same frequency that rights and liberties in India have changed, right? So there's a very big difference between de jure rules that are on the paper and how and when those rules are applied in practice. There's also a question of where do institutions come from, right? Elites introduce these institutions. Elites decide which institutional rules stay and which should be changed. And so, for me, I think there's a very big difference when you look at the performance of institutions in India and the performance of rights and liberties. So I think if you look at institutional performance, there's been a very steady decline in how Parliament, for example, which should be a central, vibrant institution in any democracy, especially a parliamentary democracy, has really declined over the years, by any measure, participation, discussion, deliberation, oversight of the executive. So, the design of procedural rules, the anti-defection bill, these things don't tell you why bills are being passed without quorum present. They don't tell you why there is no deliberation of bills in the House. Right? These are things that are coming from the quality of politicians and parties that are participating in these institutions. Okay. And so for me, that is why I come back. And what I see is the quality of political parties and the quality of politicians has declined dramatically over time. So that is one big reason why I think Indian democracy is where it is today.
Can I come back to you just so I can bring in Professor Ganguly, and then I'll come back to you. Professor Ganguly, you too have a grim portrait of India's democracy in your essay. Though towards the end, you do say that there are 2 points or 2 hints of hope. One is that you believe that you see signs of assertion by the judiciary. 2, you see signs of coming alive or sort of a little flapping of an otherwise dying, decimated opposition. Go ahead, Professor Ganguly.
Thank you. A number of the issues that I was going to raise have already been tackled by my colleagues. For example, just to follow up on Professor Yadav, the Soviet Constitution also promised an entire array of rights, but it was always within the context of socialist construction. And the how you construed socialist construction, in effect, defined the rights and constrained the rights. So constitutional design certainly can give individuals, and particularly elite politicians, considerable power of how they can interpret and implement those provisions. What is distinctly different, particularly since 2019 in India, is that now institutions are being abused in a far more systematic fashion. The use of the Enforcement Directorate, the use of the Central Bureau of Investigation, the systematic targeting of dissenters, whether in civil society or any member of the opposition who comes across as being even mildly obstreperous is being subjected to investigations launched on absolutely tenuous grounds. Again, I agree with Maya and others that it's not as if Indian democracy has been flawless. I just gave a talk 2 weeks ago here at the University of Heidelberg where I argued that yes, Indian democracy has always had flaws, has always has shortcomings, but frankly, which democracy has not? The US, for all practical purposes, was an apartheid state till 1964,
Right.
until the passage of the Omnibus Civil Rights Act.
Right.
So, sorry.
No, I was just going to take that last point of yours, that if every democracy is in some ways a work in progress, then I think the tougher job at this moment is to identify what specifically is happening. And some of you have put forth the point about institutions. I want to bring in to Rahul at this point, because Rahul, you actually don't see it like that. You're saying, yes, some institutions are certainly diminishing in their freedoms, but we've been in this moment before. And, in particular, if we look back at the Indira Gandhi years, there are instances of the BBC having been banned for 2 years. There was, of course, the emergency, even the idea of the foreign hand, the external enemy, sort of tapping into parochial nativist sentiments and rallying troops, misuse of institutions, invoking president's rule. All of this, in some ways, if you're prepared to go back in history, some would argue has happened before. Do you agree? Do you see that differently, Rahul?
I fear that many of my arguments would be read as whataboutery. And sometimes I think whataboutery should also become a legitimate form of making arguments. So let me, it's not, should we be concerned about democratic health of our country and any other country? Yes, always, because democracy is a living entity. It has never been perfect. And so we should always be watchful and concerned. I think where there are disagreement amongst us and perhaps with other scholars is about how much should we be concerned, and it's a matter of degree, right? And so no one is making and I completely agree with this point, that, and I've written about it, some of these things which Vineeta pointed out, that in some ways, even if you just talk about the electoral side for a moment and leave the liberal side, even in the electoral side, we are having some expansive notions of democracy, participation, representation, and other things. But as Vineeta rightly pointed out, even in the electoral side, what we are witnessing is decline in quality of politicians. We are seeing much more centralization within our political parties. Parties are becoming dynasties. Now, where do this movement start? It starts in the very same phase of 1990s. Most of these political parties and politicians originate in the 1990s phase when democracy was expanding. So in some ways, Indian democracy is basically showing you two faces, Janus faced every time. In some ways it expands, in some ways it also shrinks. Even let's talk about now the liberal side on the media freedoms. At this moment of time, you have many more platforms you ever had, right? More newspapers, more YouTube channels, more news channels. So you have much more diversity of opinions that you might be able to see. Yes, the government of the day sometimes uses like those who dissent and calls them by names, or anti-national or those kind of things. But didn't it happen in the past? Didn't opposition then was accused being agents of CIA and all those things? What is actually making this point is, yes, India should be compared against its own benchmark, and we need to have a much more critical study of our past to be able to say what's happening in the present.
Let me take that around, and I'm going to have to request all of you to just be a little more brief, because we're limited on time and there are five of you. So I want to just pick up Rahul's last point and perhaps take it back to Sumit Ganguly. The Press Freedom Index that the government disowned and said that its transparency is questionable. Forget what the government said for a moment. People looked at it and said, how can Afghanistan outperform India? I mean, look what Afghanistan is going through. And there's been a lot of debate around these indices. So I don't know if we should go by these indices, but so let me pick up Rahul's last point. Have we not been here before? And if we have, what's different about now? What's different from this moment when we compare it to the time that Indira Gandhi blocked the BBC for 2 years? Yeah, Professor Ganguly, can we unmute him, please?
Yeah,
go ahead.
If I could jump into the fray.
Yes.
I see Mrs. Gandhi's state of emergency as a lapse, as a departure from Indian democracy. And even Mrs. Gandhi called for elections because her sycophants had told her that she would undoubtedly win. And when she lost the election, she walked away, to her credit. Despite the many egregious things that happened during the state of emergency. What is different today is that these are not lapses. The harassment of politicians, the systematic attempts to suppress dissent, the routine attempts to muzzle the press, these are becoming routine features of Indian democracy. Indian democracy used to be much more boisterous, much more noisy. The Indian press used to be far more feisty. So I don't think we can simply dismiss this as recency. I think that's too easy a verbal sleight of hand. I think there are benchmarks that we can turn to.
Okay, let me bring in Vineeta Yadav. Miss Yadav, go ahead. This idea in your essay of the elite, the political elite, the old elite, somehow having to carry a share of the responsibility, I want you to explain that.
So, I mean, if you look at the institutional, the performance of institutions, right? So again, I'll go back to Parliament, the bureaucracy, and the police, sort of the institutions that are most critical to democracy, Parliament, and the institutions that normal citizens have a lot of interaction with. What we see is a decline starts really in the 60s with the bureaucracy, and then, with Parliament in the 70s, right? So it definitely is something that predates the influence of the BJP. The BJP in no way is responsible for starting that trend, right? But I think when you look at, civil liberties, the extent to which liberties have fallen in the last 15 years is dramatically higher. And I think really, I will emphasize Dr. Ganguly's point, which is that, Indira Gandhi's violations of civil liberties happened largely during the emergency. The bureaucracy was misused, all of these things, but the civil liberty violations that we remember from that era happened when India was a declared state of emergency country. That is not the case today. This is normal, non-emergency times, and we are seeing very, very dramatic declines in the quality of rights and liberties Indians enjoy, and there are systematic differences in who is able to exercise these rights, right?
Right.
So 15% of our population can't. That is a problem. So
Okay.
I think the previous elites, the previous politicians definitely bear responsibility for that, right?
No
one's excusing that. But I think there is an escalation that has happened. And that is something that I think we have to look at the current set of politicians in the BJP and outside the BJP. Again, it's not that the BJP is the only political party today that is violating rights. As some of my colleagues have pointed out, a lot of state governments that are led by non-BJP parties are also violating the rights of citizens and engaging in undemocratic behavior.
And I want to take up that last point to Maya Tudor. That is what the BJP supporters argue, Maya. They say that a lot of noise and attention is made when, for example, it comes to the BJP's behavior, but when it comes to state leaders, many of whom are extremely powerful. Let's take the media, for example. We've had, state level media entirely dependent in part on government advertisements. So whether it's at the center of the state, there's a way to muzzle the press straight away. It goes back to revenue models. That's one example. We've seen people jailed both at state levels and, at central levels for a Facebook post. So I think the argument that the BJP supporters would make is, why don't you make a noise when it happens on the watch of Sharad Pawar or Mamata Banerjee? That's question one. And my own question is a little more complicated. If we went out and we asked people who are not students of democracy, not experts like all of you, and ask them, do you think you're in a democracy? Most people still understand democracy through the prism of elections, through the prism of electoral rights and equal access to what the state provides. So the shorthand understanding of democracy may be very different from what you're arguing. Maya, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think these are some great points. And I guess there are 2 points I want to. So I think the first is about the question of the space for dissent, right? So we've been talking about the fact that there's been diversifying media platforms, and that's great for democracy. So I think that's absolutely true. But the question is not whether there are more fora. The question is whether those fora feel able to criticize the government on an issue they feel critical of the government on. And we should all be critical of governments, right? We should all be calling, and I think BJP and non-BJP absolutely alike. So, we should be calling out governments. And I think there has been a history of calling out governments at the state level that are intimidating media and such like. So I think the question is, if you pull out, and I think, Barkha, that's a really great way to put it, like the average person on the street, and you ask them to think about how do they understand democracy. One way is of looking at this moment of election, which at the national level, right, happens about every 5 years. But democracy, we all agree, is not just that moment, which is one short snapshot in time, but it's what happens in between. And I think the way to understand that is to ask the average person, when you feel critical of the government on something, whatever it is, demonetization, it's COVID policy, you name it, do you feel able to go out in a public forum and be critical of your government? Because if that is not the case, then we are in trouble. And so that's the first point. The second point I want to make is about the comparison to the emergency. And I think this is when we've all been to compare India to other democracies. But let's have a think about that 18-month period in which, with the stroke of a pen, Indira Gandhi, a non-BJP politician, summarily rid India of not just elections, but the right to dissent and the right, in fact, of average people to go out on the streets and say, I am critical of what the government is doing. And people felt that. People felt afraid to criticize Indira Gandhi's government. And I think the question I would ask is the same thing true today? And unlike the ability to restore civil liberties with a stroke of a pen, now we're in a situation where they are slowly ratcheting down, like a little bit like a frog in a boiling pot. We say, oh, but it's not urgency because all those institutions still exist. So I think the point is not what institutions still exist, but whether you feel able, without being trolled, to say this is a problem. And I think I see that it's substantially changed.
I have to give the last word to Tripurdaman because we could go on, but I'm out of time. Closing word to you, Tripurdaman.
I think just 2 quick points. One, of course, is historically, Indian democracy has always kind of oscillated between these 2 extremes. It hasn't fallen off the rails on either extreme. It hasn't lapsed into complete and utter dictatorship. It hasn't lapsed into complete and utter anarchy. And it doesn't look like it's likely to lapse into any of those 2 at any point soon either. One. The second is, I think there's quite a contradiction in India, and there always has been, between these 2 kinds of democratic ideals: electoral mobilization, contestation, competition on one side, and this question of civil liberties, dissent, procedural elements of democracy on the other. And it's a paradox. It's a paradox that we can't seem to bridge, and it's an open question. It's likely to continue being an open question, which is that the more Indian democracy, because of the way Indian society is structured, of the beliefs that that guide it, the more Indian politics becomes democratic, in the sense that it comes into it comes in line with the general belief, general opinions, general political ideals, which most Indians consider reasonable, as you mentioned, which most Indians consider democratic, which most Indians consider as the norm. And it of course, the more it's likely to become undemocratic on certain other parameters, on certain other ideals, which is the sort of traditional ideological conceptions that India's founders and nationalist leaders had. And that's a paradox which is going to be difficult to bridge as we continue, because many of these questions do not enjoy as much public traction as we would like them to enjoy.
Well, we hope that by starting this conversation, we get more members of the public engaged with it. I have to thank my panel. I'm sorry, no time is enough time for such a big question. But do pick up the Journal of Democracy, the essays by Professors Ganguly, Yadav, Singh, Verma, and Tudor are available. They have very different perspectives, and I think you'll enjoy reading them and learn a lot from them as much as I did. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care, and thanks to our audience. See you tomorrow. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.